Victor Ashton sat alone in the sunlit dining room of his mansion, the polished table stretching before him like an endless reminder of his own solitude. 5 years had passed since his wife, Elena, had disappeared. It was as if she'd simply vanished into thin air one evening, leaving behind a few hastily packed bags and a trail that ended as abruptly as it began. He'd exhausted every possible avenue in trying to locate her. Private investigators, the police, and even his own network of contacts had all failed to yield any answers. In the end, he'd buried himself in work, numbing himself with board meetings and the endless machinations of corporate life, but nothing had truly filled the void she'd left behind. Now, as he sipped his coffee in the quiet, cavernous dining hall, he noticed Ava, one of the cleaners he barely knew, quietly working nearby. Her movements were quick and precise, hands gloved as she dusted the shelves lining the room. She was a slender woman in her mid-20s, always dressed modestly in her cleaning uniform, with her hair neatly tied back. Victor's attention drifted to her, idly at first, but then his gaze fell on something glinting around her neck, a pendant. He squinted, trying to make out its details. There was something achingly familiar about it. His mind snapped back to a memory of Elena's anniversary gift, a unique pendant he'd designed for her, with a delicate emerald center surrounded by filigree in the shape of an intricate rose. It had been one of a kind, a symbol of their commitment, and the last time he'd seen it was around her neck the night she disappeared. Victor felt his heart skip a beat. How could this woman have that same pendant? Trying to suppress the sudden tension in his chest, Victor cleared his throat, startling Ava. She looked up, blinking at him in surprise. He smiled politely, masking his turmoil. "Ava, isn't it?" he asked, his tone warm. "I don't believe we've ever spoken much. How long have you been working here?" She looked hesitant, as if surprised by his attention. "Yes, Mr. Ashton," she replied. "I've been here for nearly 2 years." Victor nodded, taking a moment to observe her. She seemed genuine, polite, and reserved, a demeanor that suggested she wouldn't have come by the pendant in any dishonest way. Still, the sight of it had his mind reeling. Trying to keep his voice even, he asked, "I was thinking of having a late lunch. Would you care to join me?" Ava's eyes widened, and she looked taken aback, glancing around as if she hadn't heard him correctly. "Oh, I don't usually eat here, sir," she stammered. "But thank you." "It's no trouble, Ava," he insisted with a reassuring smile. "Consider it a break. You work hard here, and I rarely get a chance to speak to anyone outside of business circles." After a brief hesitation, Ava nodded, her cheeks reddening slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Ashton. I'd be honored." They settled at the table in a smaller, cozier nook of the dining room. Victor observed Ava as she sat down, her movements tentative. She wore her uniform with a sense of pride, her posture poised yet humble. For a few moments, they exchanged polite words about the weather and work around the estate. But Victor's thoughts kept returning to the pendant. At last, he leaned forward, deciding to broach the subject directly. "I noticed the pendant you're wearing," he said, keeping his tone light but his eyes on hers. "It's quite unique. May I ask where you got it?" Ava's hand instinctively went to the pendant, her fingers brushing over its surface. She glanced down, an almost sad smile flitting across her face. "It was a gift from my mother," she replied softly. "She gave it to me before she passed away. I've had it for as long as I can remember." Victor's pulse quickened. The details matched too closely to be mere coincidence. "Did she ever mention where she got it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ava shook her head. "No, she didn't. My mother wasn't one to talk much about her past. She always said that the pendant was precious and that I should keep it safe, but she never explained why. It was just one of those things we didn't discuss." Victor's mind was already spinning with possibilities. It was inconceivable that there could be two such identical pieces, and yet here he was, seated across from a young woman who knew nothing of its origin. He realized he would have to tread carefully if he wanted to learn more. "That's fascinating," he said, choosing his words with care. "It's truly a unique piece. Do you mind if I take a closer look?" She hesitated for a moment before slipping it off and placing it in his hand. As Victor examined the pendant, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was no mistaking it. The delicate engravings, the weight, the way the light refracted through the emerald. It was identical in every detail to the pendant he'd designed for Elena. He handed it back to Ava, his mind whirling. "Thank you. It's truly beautiful." He paused, carefully considering his next words. "I hope you don't find this strange, but this pendant, it bears a striking resemblance to one I once had made for my wife." Ava looked up at him, her expression one of polite surprise, but there was a faint flicker of curiosity in her gaze. "Really?" she asked, holding the pendant up and studying it with new interest. "I suppose it must have been a very special gift then." Victor nodded, and an ache bloomed in his chest as he remembered. Yes, it was. She wore it often. He paused, his gaze drifting to a distant point, lost in memories. "I designed it myself. It was meant to be one of a kind." Ava lowered her gaze, clearly sensing his pain. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I can't imagine what it must be like to lose someone so close to you." Victor swallowed, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. The pendant had connected them in a way he hadn't expected. He took a deep breath, collecting himself. "Thank you, Ava. I appreciate your understanding." They finished lunch in relative silence, but Victor's mind was alive with questions. Who was this woman? And how had she come to possess the same pendant he had once gifted to Elena? Victor barely slept that night, his mind racing with the implications of the pendant and Ava's vague family history. The pendant had to be the same one he'd given Elena. Every detail, the delicate rose filigree, the emerald that had been custom cut, matched perfectly. The coincidence was too stark, the odds too impossible. Somehow, the pendant had made its way to Ava. But how? And why? The next morning, Victor wasted no time contacting his longtime private investigator, Greg Harmon. Greg had been the lead investigator in the search for Elena, combing through countless leads, surveillance footage, and dead ends. Though they had failed to find her, Greg had always assured Victor he'd done everything possible. This time, however, Victor sensed a renewed sense of urgency in Greg's voice when he explained the situation over the phone. "Same pendant?" Greg murmured on the other end of the line, his tone skeptical but intrigued. "That's a hell of a coincidence, Victor. If it's true, there's a chance Ava might be connected to Elena in ways we hadn't thought of. I'll start by looking into her family background." "Yes, do that," Victor replied. "But keep it quiet. I don't want Ava to know just yet. I'd rather approach this carefully." Hanging up, Victor felt an odd mix of anticipation and dread. Part of him yearned for answers, for any remaining tie to Elena, but another part feared what he might uncover. Had she really left him willingly? Or was there something darker he had missed? As he looked around his lavish office, Victor was overcome with the painful reminder that he hadn't been able to protect her or prevent her from disappearing. Perhaps he could at least understand why. Later that day, Victor made his way to the garden terrace where Ava was tidying up the patio furniture. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves tumbled in the breeze. Ava was focused, humming quietly to herself as she worked, her pendant gleaming in the midday sun. Victor approached her, his curiosity outweighing his hesitation. "Ava," he began, trying to keep his tone light. She looked up, startled, and quickly composed herself, smiling politely. "Mr. Ashton, is there something I can do for you?" she asked. "Not exactly. I was hoping we could continue our conversation from yesterday. You mentioned that your mother gave you that pendant," he said, gesturing subtly to the necklace. "Do you remember anything else about it?" Ava blinked, clearly caught off guard by his directness. She touched the pendant lightly, her fingers brushing its intricate design. "As I said, it was one of the few things she left me. My mother, she didn't talk much about her past. She was a private person, I guess you could say. Did she ever mention anyone specific from her past? A close friend, perhaps? Or any family?" he pressed gently. Ava's expression darkened as she looked down. "Not really," she admitted. "She passed away when I was young, so I don't remember much. My grandmother raised me, but she didn't know much about my mother's younger years either." Victor could sense the genuine sadness in her words, but even as she spoke, he could see the glimmer of pain in her eyes. She wasn't lying. She truly didn't know where the pendant had come from. Still, there was more he needed to understand. "I'm sorry for asking so many questions, Ava," he said, forcing a small smile. "It's just that the pendant reminds me of someone very dear to me." Ava looked up, her expression softening. "It's okay. I can see it means a lot to you. I wish I had more answers, but my mother's past is a bit of a mystery to me, too." Victor nodded, struggling to suppress the questions piling up in his mind. He realized he had pushed as far as he could for now, and thanked her before excusing himself. As the day wore on, Victor grew increasingly restless. He found himself pacing the hallways, his thoughts spiraling. If Ava's mother was somehow connected to Elena, how had she come to possess that pendant? It made him wonder if there had been another life, another secret side to Elena that he had never known. He hated the thought, but the clues were becoming too difficult to ignore. Finally, late that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from Greg. "Got some preliminary findings. Ava's mother's records are patchy, no birth certificate or known family, and she moved often. Nothing concrete, but it's clear she kept a low profile." Victor's stomach churned. No records, no family. It sounded almost as if Ava's mother had been hiding, just like Elena. The thought unsettled him, but his determination only grew. The following evening, Victor invited Ava to join him in the study, under the pretense of discussing her work schedule. She looked slightly nervous as she entered, glancing at the ornate shelves lined with leather-bound books. He gestured for her to sit, and they exchanged brief pleasantries before he broached the topic that had been consuming his thoughts. "Ava, I wanted to ask if you've ever considered finding out more about your family history," he said carefully. She tilted her head, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I've thought about it, yes, but I don't know where to start. I mean, I have no records or even much to go on, just vague memories and, well, this pendant." Victor felt a pang of empathy for her. She looked so young and lost, yet beneath that quiet exterior, he sensed a resilience. Her life, he realized, had likely not been easy. "You mentioned your grandmother raised you. Did she ever speak of your mother's past?" he asked gently. Ava shook her head, biting her lip thoughtfully. "Not really. I was always told that my mother was a free spirit. She didn't stay in one place long. My grandmother hinted that she might have been running from something, but I never got any details." Victor's mind raced. The notion of Ava's mother running from something brought up memories of Elena's own disappearance. He could still recall her occasional silences, her evasiveness about her past, but he'd never questioned it deeply, until now. "I see," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Would you be open to letting someone help you with your search? I know a good investigator who could help piece together some information." Ava looked surprised. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Ashton. But are you sure? I wouldn't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he assured her with a warm smile. "Consider it my way of repaying a kindness. I think you deserve to know where you come from." Ava's face softened, and for the first time, she looked truly at ease. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know. I've always wondered about my mother's life before I came along. I want to understand her, even if it's painful." Victor nodded, suppressing the surge of hope in his chest. He arranged for Greg to officially take on Ava's case, knowing that the truth, whatever it was now closer than ever. As he watched her leave, a flicker of anticipation and fear brewed within him. The pendant, the missing records, the mother's hidden life. All signs pointed to a tangled history that might bring both answers and a renewed pain he wasn't sure he was prepared to face. But one way or another, he was determined to uncover the truth. Days passed, but Victor's mind remained fixated on the pendant. He found himself distracted in meetings, lost in thought during dinners, and pacing his office late at night. Greg's sparse updates only fueled his unease. The investigator had dug into Ava's mother's history and discovered that she had changed her name several times and avoided any permanent ties. This evasive life mirrored Elena's last few years, making Victor wonder if Elena and Ava's mother had indeed crossed paths, or if they'd both been running from a shared secret. Despite his suspicions, Victor knew he couldn't keep pestering Ava with questions. Her presence in his home had taken on an almost spectral quality. Every time he saw her, He felt Elena's memory flicker between them, stirring his grief and unresolved longing. He decided to keep his curiosity restrained for now, letting Greg's investigations unfold in the background. One evening, Victor was walking past the gallery when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to find Ava hesitating in the doorway, a notebook in her hands. "Mr. Ashton," she began, her voice small but steady. "Do you mind if I ask you something? It's about my mother's investigation." Victor raised an eyebrow, nodding. He'd been wondering how long it would take before she grew curious about Greg's inquiries. "Of course, Ava. Please, come in." She joined him in the gallery, her eyes sweeping over the elegant oil paintings and the dim light casting shadows along the walls. It was a quiet, somewhat somber room, perfect for conversations that felt as delicate as the memories it held. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, fiddling nervously with the pendant around her neck. "About my mother's past and this pendant. I'm beginning to feel like maybe I'm supposed to know something. That maybe it's important." Victor studied her expression, noting the mixture of hope and anxiety in her gaze. "Why do you feel that way?" he asked, genuinely curious. Ava took a deep breath. "I never told you this, but my mother used to get anxious if she thought people were watching us. She would tell me to hide the pendant if anyone asked about it. I remember her whispering, 'They mustn't know.' I never understood who she was talking about or why she was so paranoid." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. "Did she ever say who they were?" Ava shook her head. "No, but sometimes I would catch her staring at this pendant, almost like she was talking to someone, or remembering something she couldn't forget." Victor absorbed this in silence. It struck him how much this mirrored his own experience with Elena. She had been similar, guarded, occasionally paranoid, keeping certain memories locked away. He began to wonder if Elena's disappearance was somehow connected to Ava's mother, and if the secret she'd taken with her might still be hidden in his own mansion. "Ava," he said slowly, "if you'd be open to it, I'd like Greg to look into some things beyond just your mother's past. It's possible that the answers might involve people closer to me than I originally thought." Ava's expression was one of shock mixed with worry. "Do you really think my mother was somehow connected to your wife?" Victor hesitated, feeling the weight of his words before he spoke. "I can't say for sure, but I do know that certain details match. It's too early to jump to conclusions, but I believe there's more to this pendant than we've realized." Ava nodded, the seriousness of his tone leaving her visibly unsettled. She looked at him, and he saw the same desperate longing for answers that had haunted him for years. They were two people bound by a strange thread of shared mystery. "If it would help, I'm willing to share anything else I remember about my mother," she said softly. "I've gone so long without knowing. I'd be grateful for any answers." Victor's mind flashed with a vivid memory of Elena, the night he'd first given her the pendant. They'd been on a weekend trip, away from the city's noise, and she had looked up at him with a rare, unguarded smile. He had fallen even more in love with her that night, her laughter filling the air like a melody he could never forget. He'd given her that pendant as a symbol of his promise to protect her, to cherish her. But had he, in some way, failed her? As he looked at Ava, he made a quiet vow to himself. He wouldn't fail again. That night, Victor contacted Greg, sharing every detail Ava had recounted. Greg listened carefully, his tone thoughtful when he responded. "This is more than we expected," Greg admitted. "If both Elena and Ava's mother were running from something or someone, it might explain their secrecy and the pendant's significance. I'll expand the search, but this could take time." Victor exhaled slowly. "Do what you need to do. Just be thorough." Days slipped by, each one slower than the last. Victor threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the creeping anxiety. Yet, even in the quietest moments, he could feel the unanswered questions gnawing at him. Then, nearly a week later, Greg called him in the early hours of the morning. "I've found something," Greg said, his voice unusually tense. Ava's mother, who went by Lydia in her later years, appears to have been linked to a network involved in dealing rare and valuable gems. It's not widely known, but these dealers were notorious for going off the radar to protect their identities. Your wife's name doesn't appear in connection to this group directly, but there was a woman who matched her description seen at an auction in Monaco the year she disappeared. Victor gripped the phone, his pulse pounding. He'd known Elena as a reserved, thoughtful woman who had never shown interest in anything illicit or dangerous. But was it possible that her life had intersected with this world without him realizing it? What does this mean, Greg? Are you saying that Elena was part of this network? Greg sighed. It's hard to say, but we're piecing together a pattern. These dealers were often careful to leave behind few traces, and Lydia, Ava's mother, seems to have been known among them by a different name, Rosa. If Elena knew her, it might explain why your wife was so guarded. Maybe she wasn't running away from you. Maybe she was trying to protect you. Victor sank into his chair, Greg's words echoing in his mind. Trying to protect you. The notion that Elena might have loved him enough to disappear for his sake only deepened the ache in his chest. And if Ava's mother, Lydia, had been part of that world, then Ava herself might be at risk simply by wearing that pendant. Greg, I want you to dig deeper, Victor said, his voice low but determined. I need to know if there's any connection to Ava, and find out if there's anyone who might still be looking for that pendant. Understood, Greg replied. I'll get back to you as soon as I find anything. Victor ended the call, his mind swirling. He knew he needed to talk to Ava, but he couldn't bring himself to involve her further without having concrete answers. She had been through enough, and he didn't want to burden her with more questions or fears. As he sat alone in the dim light of his study, he traced the path of his memories with Elena, each one a painful reminder of how little he had known about her secret life. His thoughts returned to Ava, her familiar pendant, and her quiet resilience. In her, he saw a reflection of Elena's mystery and strength, a reminder that even in his search for answers, there might be painful truths he hadn't been ready to face. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope and fear in equal measure. Victor spent the next few days in an agonizing limbo. With every quiet hour, his mind circled back to the pendant, the secrets of Ava's mother, and the gnawing suspicion that Elena's past was much more complex than he had imagined. He tried to keep his distance from Ava, wanting to protect her from the heavy weight of his questions until he had more clarity. On the fourth evening, Victor was in his study, nursing a drink and staring into the crackling fire, when his phone buzzed. It was Greg. I've managed to track down an old acquaintance of Lydia's from the jewelry network, Greg said, his voice low and cautious. Her name's Simone Turner. She operated under the radar for years, but she left the network around the same time your wife disappeared. I convinced her to talk, but there's a catch. She'll only speak in person, and she insists it has to be discreet. Victor felt a surge of apprehension. This was the closest they'd come to uncovering the truth, but it was also clear that any step forward could unravel dark secrets he hadn't foreseen. I'll do it, he replied without hesitation. Arrange a meeting. Greg set it up for the next day in a quiet, unassuming cafe in a neighboring town. Victor arrived early, taking a table in a corner where he could observe the door. A few minutes later, an older woman with short silver hair and a sleek, tailored coat stepped in, her gaze sharp as she scanned the room. When her eyes met Victor's, she walked over, sitting across from him without a word. Simone Turner, he asked. She gave a curt nod, setting her bag on the table. Let's make this quick. I don't owe you any favors, Mr. Ashton, but your investigator assured me you're after the truth, and I don't like leaving loose ends. Her voice was smooth, but there was a guarded edge to her expression. Thank you for meeting with me, Victor said, keeping his tone respectful. I want to know more about Lydia, Ava's mother, and if you know anything about my wife, Elena. Simone's expression softened slightly at the mention of Lydia. Lydia was a complicated woman, she said, almost to herself. She got involved with us, let's call us a network. To make ends meet, yes, but also for something more. She wanted out of something dark, something from her past. That pendant you're asking about? It was more than just jewelry. It was her symbol, a kind of protection. We all had one, but hers was unique. Victor's pulse quickened. So, she was in hiding? Simone nodded, glancing around the cafe as if to ensure no one was listening. Lydia was clever. She used her connections to stay invisible, moving between identities like water. She rarely spoke of her life before joining the network, but one name did come up now and then: Elena. The mention of his wife's name hit Victor like a punch to the gut. He had suspected the connection, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it weight. "What did Lydia say about her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Simone's eyes held a glimmer of sympathy. Elena was like a sister to her. They shared a bond that went deeper than most. Lydia once confided that she feared Elena's secrets would catch up to her one day. I don't know what those secrets were, but if Lydia was running, Elena might have been too. Victor felt a mixture of relief and despair. He wanted to believe Elena had been honest with him, but if she'd been keeping secrets this profound, then their entire marriage had rested on a lie. "So you're saying she was hiding something from me?" Simone held his gaze firmly. "I don't know you well enough to answer that, but I do know Lydia left Ava the pendant as a last link to Elena. She said it was a kind of key, but she never explained what that meant." Victor's heart pounded as he processed this. The pendant was more than a keepsake. It was a key, though to what, he had no idea. He thanked Simone, offering her a generous sum for her time, but she waved it off, insisting she had simply fulfilled an old promise. That evening, Victor returned home with a whirlwind of thoughts. The pendant, the key, the bond between Elena and Lydia, it was all tangled together in ways he could barely grasp. He wanted to tell Ava everything he had learned, but he feared that this revelation would overwhelm her. Still, he could no longer ignore the connection between their lives. The next morning, he found Ava cleaning the library, carefully dusting the rows of books that filled the shelves. She looked up when he entered, giving him a tentative smile. "Mr. Ashton," she greeted, "is there something you need?" Victor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Actually, Ava, I was hoping we could speak privately. There are some developments regarding the search for your mother's history." Ava's eyes widened, and she set down the duster, nodding as he led her to the study. Once they were seated, Victor took a deep breath. "Ava," he began gently, "I met with someone who knew your mother from many years ago. This person confirmed that your mother and my wife, Elena, were connected." Ava's face filled with surprise and confusion. "Connected? But how? My mother never mentioned anything about knowing someone like your wife." "I don't think she would have," Victor said, choosing his words carefully. "It seems that both your mother and Elena were involved with a hidden network, people who dealt with rare gems and valuables. It was a dangerous circle, and from what I've learned, both women may have been in hiding." Ava's expression shifted from confusion to something more solemn, her hand instinctively reaching for the pendant. "So, my mother was hiding this from me to protect me." Victor nodded. "It seems so, but there's more. This pendant you wear, Ava, according to the person I spoke to, it's not just jewelry. Your mother called it a key. She never explained what it unlocked, but it was clearly important." Ava glanced down at the pendant, her fingers tracing its edges. "A key? I always thought it was just a reminder of her." It's hard to believe it might actually mean something. Victor felt a pang of sympathy as he watched her struggle with the implications. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said softly, "but I wanted you to know. This pendant could be linked to whatever Elena and your mother were running from." Ava looked up, her expression resolute. "Then we need to find out what it unlocks. If it meant that much to my mother and to Elena, then maybe it's the answer to everything." Victor's respect for Ava deepened as he saw her determination. Despite the overwhelming circumstances, she seemed as resolute as he was to uncover the truth. Together, they agreed to search the mansion for anything that might connect to the pendant. The search took them late into the night. Room by room, they scoured the mansion, examining old trunks, hidden compartments, and anything that might yield a clue. After hours of fruitless searching, they found themselves in Victor's private office, where he kept his most prized possessions. As they were about to leave the room, Ava's gaze fell on an old painting above the fireplace, a pastoral landscape that Elena had always loved. Ava paused, a strange look crossing her face. "Mr. Ashton," she whispered, "do you see that design in the corner of the frame?" Victor squinted, stepping closer. In the corner of the painting, barely visible, was a small, intricate rose carved into the wood, the same rose design as on the pendant. "This was Elena's favorite painting," he murmured, his fingers tracing the rose carving. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed on the corner of the frame, feeling it shift under his touch. To his astonishment, a small compartment opened, revealing a slim, velvet-bound notebook inside. Victor carefully took out the notebook, his hands trembling. He opened it to the first page, and there, in Elena's familiar handwriting, was a single sentence. "To whoever finds this, know that I loved you enough to disappear." Ava gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the words over his shoulder. Page by page, Victor and Ava read through the journal, each entry revealing a new layer of the mystery. Elena had indeed been involved with the network, initially out of financial need, but later as a means of protecting someone precious, someone she loved. The journal hinted at secrets about Lydia's life, too, and spoke of a final plan the two women had concocted in case their enemies caught up to them. The last entry, however, ended abruptly with a hastily written sentence. "If anything happens to me, keep Ava safe. The pendant is her protection." Victor closed the notebook, his heart pounding. He felt as if he were holding the last piece of Elena's life, a final message she'd left behind. He looked at Ava, whose face was pale but resolute. "This pendant," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's more than a memory, isn't it? It's my mother's way of keeping me safe, even now." Victor nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, Ava. And I believe it's time we find out what she was protecting you from." Victor and Ava sat together in silence, both trying to process the emotional weight of the discovery they had just made. The notebook, filled with Elena's final words, held the key to understanding her sudden disappearance, but it also opened up a new world of dark, unanswered questions. They had read every page, but there were gaps in the story, mentions of a powerful adversary, vague references to a last resort, and a final note imploring whoever found the notebook to keep Ava safe. It seemed Elena had been entangled in something far more dangerous than Victor had ever imagined. And now, Ava's life was directly implicated in that danger. Victor felt an urgent need to call Greg and bring him up to speed on what they had uncovered. He left Ava in the study, promising her that they'd go through the notebook again in the morning, and stepped into his office to make the call. "Victor?" Greg's voice sounded groggy. It was close to midnight, but he answered on the second ring. "What happened?" Victor relayed the night's discoveries, his tone tense and rushed. He described the hidden compartment in the painting, Elena's journal, and the unsettling revelations it contained. Greg listened in silence until Victor finished, then took a deep breath. "This just confirms what I suspected, Victor," Greg said after a pause. Elena and Lydia, or Rosa, as she was known in the network, were mixed up in more than just rare jewels. From what I'm piecing together, they were involved with a high-stakes trafficking ring, dealing not only in jewels but in secrets. They might have been privy to information that others were desperate to protect. Victor's pulse quickened. "And this protection Elena mentioned in the journal, does it mean that Ava is in some kind of danger because of it?" "Possibly," Greg replied, his tone serious. "If these people believed Elena and Lydia were in possession of something valuable, documents, evidence, or some leverage, they might have eliminated them to silence them. And if they suspect Ava has inherited that knowledge, she could very well be their next target." A cold dread settled over Victor. For years, he'd lived with the grief of losing Elena, only to now face the horrifying possibility that she had been murdered to cover up secrets she could no longer keep. "Greg," Victor said, steadying his voice, "what do we do next? How can we keep Ava safe?" "We need to find out exactly what these people are after," Greg said. "The notebook was a good start, but there has to be more." Elena mentioned a final plan. "Did she ever give you anything that seemed unusual? Something she might have left behind as leverage?" Victor thought hard, sifting through his memories, but nothing came to mind. Elena had been careful, never leaving any obvious hints of a secret life. "There's nothing that I know of," he admitted, frustration creeping into his voice. "But if there was something, how would we even know where to look?" Greg was silent for a moment. "I'll keep digging. Meanwhile, you should watch over Ava. Whatever this pendant protects, it may be her only shield against whoever might be out there." The next morning, Victor explained everything to Ava, leaving nothing out. She sat quietly as he spoke, her eyes widening with every new detail, her hand clutching the pendant as if it might shield her from the truth. When he finished, she looked down, her face pale. "So my mother didn't just leave me with memories," she murmured. "She left me with a target on my back." Victor reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Ava. I promised Elena I'd protect her, and that promise now extends to you." Ava's face softened, and she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Ashton. I don't know what I would do if you weren't helping me through this." They agreed to spend the day examining every inch of the mansion in search of any other hidden clues Elena might have left behind. Together, they combed through old family rooms, closets, and storage spaces, looking for anything that might connect to Elena's past. As the day wore on, their hopes dwindled. It seemed that whatever final plan Elena had spoken of was still shrouded in secrecy. That evening, exhausted and feeling defeated, they decided to pause. Victor suggested they revisit the pendant itself, wondering if it might contain any hidden mechanism or marking. He fetched a magnifying glass, and under its lens, they studied the pendant closely. At first, they saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, just as Victor was about to give up, he noticed a tiny, nearly imperceptible engraving along the inner edge of the pendant. "It's a set of coordinates," he whispered, glancing at Ava in astonishment. "She left us directions." Ava's eyes widened. "Coordinates to what?" "That's what we need to find out," Victor said, his voice steady. "Pack a small bag. We're leaving in the morning." The coordinates led them to a small town nestled in the foothills of the mountains, a secluded area far from the bustle of city life. As they drove through winding roads lined with dense trees, Victor felt a growing sense of tension. Every mile brought them closer to whatever Elena had hidden, but it also meant stepping further into a world he barely understood. They reached a cabin tucked deep within the forest, surrounded by towering pines and an eerie silence. It looked abandoned, but Victor felt certain this was the place. He approached the door, knocking once before pushing it open. Inside, the cabin was simple and sparse, with wooden walls, a small fireplace, and a single chair by the window. In the center of the room stood an old trunk, its surface covered in dust. Ava instinctively stepped back, hesitating to touch anything. Victor knelt by the trunk, feeling his heart pound as he opened the latch. Inside, he found a collection of items: photographs, a faded map, letters, and a small leather-bound journal. The journal's cover bore the same rose design as the pendant, and the sight of it filled Victor with a mixture of dread and excitement. He opened the journal, flipping through the pages. It was Elena's handwriting, and each entry felt like a whisper from the past. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed to outrun them," the first entry began. "This journal contains the truth about what Lydia and I discovered, the truth that haunts us both. Keep this information safe, and protect Ava with everything you have." Ava moved closer, reading over his shoulder, her breath catching as she saw her mother's name. The journal went on to detail Elena and Lydia's involvement with a powerful group known as the Consortium. They were more than jewel dealers. They were brokers of powerful information, trading secrets, blackmail, and political leverage. Elena and Lydia had stumbled upon documents that exposed some of the Consortium's darkest dealings, and they had been on the run ever since. The final pages of the journal held a warning. "If you're ever in doubt, if you're in danger, go to the place where roses grow wild. There, you will find the last protection I could offer." Victor looked at Ava, his face grim. "Do you know what that means?" Ava's brow furrowed as she thought. Then her eyes lit up with realization. There was a rose garden, an old, hidden one. My mother used to take me there when I was little. She told me it was our secret place, where no one else would find us. Victor nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation. "Then that's where we'll go." The journey to the rose garden was quick, and soon they stood before an overgrown patch of wild roses. Ava approached carefully, memories flooding back as she knelt by a particular cluster of blooms. She brushed the dirt aside and uncovered a small, weathered box buried beneath the roses. Opening it, they found a tiny, intricately crafted metal key and a single photograph. A picture of Elena and Lydia, their arms around each other, both smiling despite the fear in their eyes. On the back, Elena had written, "For Ava, my greatest love and protection." Victor examined the key, its surface covered in delicate engravings. He recognized it as an old-fashioned safety deposit key, the kind used in private banks. "This is it, Ava. Whatever she was hiding, it's in a bank somewhere." Ava's eyes filled with tears as she held the photograph close, her voice shaking. "She did all this to protect me." Victor placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And now it's our turn to finish what she started." They returned to the mansion late that night, their minds reeling from the discoveries. Victor called Greg to update him, and they agreed to investigate banks in the area that might still honor such an old safety deposit key. It would take time, but they were closer than ever to uncovering the final truth that Elena and Lydia had sacrificed everything to protect. As Victor ended the call, he looked at Ava, his resolve strengthening. "No matter what we find, Ava, know that you're not alone in this." Ava nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Mr. Ashton. I never imagined my mother's past could be this complicated. But with you here, I feel like I can face whatever comes next." Together, they prepared for the final steps of their journey, knowing that whatever secrets the bank held would change everything. The next morning, Victor and Ava were on a mission, fueled by the discoveries of the previous night. They spent hours with Greg, narrowing down the list of banks that might house a safety deposit box tied to the key they had found. Greg's network and persistence led them to a small, private bank on the outskirts of the city, known for its discretion and high-profile clientele. The building was unassuming, a gray, nondescript structure that didn't hint at the secrets it protected. As they approached the entrance, Victor felt a wave of apprehension. Whatever lay inside could reveal the true extent of Elena and Lydia's secret lives, but it could also expose Ava to dangers far beyond his control. Victor gave Ava a reassuring nod as they entered, and together, they approached the manager, a reserved man in a tailored suit who listened intently as Victor presented the safety deposit key. The manager examined the key with a frown, then looked up at them. "This key is to a very old account. Normally, only the account holder or their estate executor is permitted access. However," he said, eyeing Victor's determined expression, "under certain circumstances, exceptions can be made." After verifying Victor's identity and clearing a series of bureaucratic hurdles, the manager led them down a quiet hallway lined with locked doors. He stopped in front of a door marked with a simple number and unlocked it, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At its center was a single, metal box covered in a thin layer of dust. "This box has been untouched for many years," the manager said, handing Victor the box. "Take all the time you need." Victor and Ava waited until he left, and then, with a deep breath, Victor turned the key. The lock clicked, and he lifted the lid. Inside, neatly organized, was a set of documents, photographs, and an old flash drive. Ava reached for the photographs first, her hands trembling. They were snapshots of Elena and Lydia, taken over several years. In each image, they were surrounded by luxurious settings, banquets, ballrooms, private gatherings with people in dark suits. But in every picture, there was a visible tension, a sense of unease in their eyes, as if they were always looking over their shoulders. Victor sifted through the documents next, carefully unfolding them. They were written in coded language, filled with strange abbreviations, but a few lines in plain text stood out. "The consortium controls more than jewels. They own governments, economies. This box contains the leverage they feared, proof of everything." Ava's eyes widened as she read over his shoulder. So my mother and Elena, they weren't just hiding from thieves. They were hiding from a powerful organization. Victor nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what they'd uncovered. The consortium, the shadowy group Lydia and Elena had become involved with, was a network that brokered secrets, traded power, and controlled information from the shadows. The documents in the box outlined transactions, contacts, and blackmail material on some of the world's most powerful figures, politicians, CEOs, diplomats. If the contents of this box ever saw the light of day, it would expose the consortium and tear down the powerful individuals it protected. He glanced at Ava, who seemed shaken by the enormity of it all. Your mother and Elena must have discovered something the consortium wanted kept hidden at all costs. These documents were their insurance, and perhaps their curse. Ava's face paled, and she clutched the pendant around her neck. So, my mother kept all this as a way to protect herself, but it only put her in more danger. Yes, Victor said grimly. They probably thought that as long as they had these documents, the consortium wouldn't harm them. But it seems that having these secrets put them directly in the line of fire. He picked up the flash drive, weighing it in his palm. This may contain more evidence, or it might be the very thing that can destroy the consortium. Ava looked at him, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. Then we need to find out what's on it. I don't want my mother's sacrifices to be in vain. They returned to the mansion and went straight to Victor's office, where he inserted the flash drive into his computer. The screen flickered to life, and a single file appeared, Project Eros. Victor opened the file, and a series of videos and documents began to load. Together, he and Ava watched in shock as footage of high-ranking officials, secret transactions, and carefully hidden espionage activities filled the screen. The videos showed powerful figures discussing under-the-table deals and leveraging influence to rig markets and manipulate governments. Some of the conversations directly implicated the consortium's most influential members. Victor leaned back, his face pale. This is damning evidence. If the world saw this, it could bring down entire governments. No wonder they went to such lengths to keep it hidden. Ava's voice was barely a whisper. My mother knew all of this. She and Elena were caught in the middle of it. And because of these secrets, they had to disappear. Victor nodded, his heart aching as he thought of Elena. She had given up everything, her life, her husband, her safety, to protect these truths. And now, because of that choice, Ava's life was entangled in this dangerous web as well. We need to be very careful, he said, shutting the computer down. Having this knowledge is a threat. If the consortium learns that we've accessed this, they won't hesitate to come after us. The next morning, Victor contacted Greg, explaining the full extent of what they had discovered. Greg's voice was grave as he replied, Victor, this is bigger than either of us. We're dealing with an organization that operates above the law. If you're set on pursuing this, we'll need protection, allies, and a way to safely release this information, assuming that's what you want to do. Victor thought for a long moment. If he exposed the consortium, he risked putting Ava, and himself, directly in their crosshairs. But if they did nothing, Ava would always be under threat, and Elena's sacrifice would mean nothing. Let's start by creating a contingency plan, Victor said. We'll make copies of the documents, store them in secure locations, and ensure they're released automatically if anything happens to us. Ava agreed, though the fear in her eyes was palpable. Together, they spent the day carefully encrypting and backing up the files, creating a system to release the evidence to the press and government agencies if they went missing or were harmed. By evening, Victor felt the weight of their decision pressing down on him. He knew they were now engaged in a dangerous game, one that would require constant vigilance. That night, Victor lay awake, thoughts of Elena swirling in his mind. Her memory was no longer simply a source of grief, but a haunting reminder of the dangerous world she had tried to shield him from. He hadn't understood then, but he understood now. She had left everything behind for him, sacrificing her life for his safety and for Ava's. It pained him to think that she had lived her last days in fear and secrecy, always looking over her shoulder. As he stared at the ceiling, a wave of resolve washed over him. He would do whatever it took to protect Ava. For Elena's sake, he couldn't let the consortium win. 2 days later, Greg arrived at the mansion with grim news. I've just intercepted a message through one of my contacts, he told Victor and Ava. The consortium suspects that someone has accessed Project Eros. They're sending someone to retrieve the files and eliminate any witnesses. Victor clenched his fists, the tension mounting. Then we don't have much time. We need to go public before they reach us. Ava nodded, though her face was pale. I'm ready. Let's end this. The following morning, Victor, Ava, and Greg worked together to send the evidence to key journalists, trusted government agencies, and independent watchdog groups. Within hours, headlines began to emerge, detailing the consortium's dark influence and the high-level corruption it had enabled. By the evening, The mansion was surrounded by journalists, eager for interviews and further details. Victor and Ava stayed inside, watching the fallout unfold on television, knowing they had done all they could to expose the truth. As the scandal erupted globally, indictments began to pour in, and officials across various industries were detained for questioning. The consortium's iron grip on power was beginning to loosen, and Victor felt a flicker of satisfaction. But his relief was short-lived. Late that night, as he and Ava prepared for bed, Victor received a message on his phone. It was from an unknown number, containing a single line of text. "You have made a grave mistake, Mr. Ashton. This isn't over." He looked at Ava, who was clutching her pendant, her face determined despite the lingering fear in her eyes. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "I'm not afraid. My mother and Elena, they did this to give me a chance. And thanks to you, I'm ready to face whatever comes." Victor nodded, feeling both pride and a fierce protectiveness toward her. They had walked through fire together, uncovering painful secrets and risking their lives to expose the truth. Whatever dangers still lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by the memories of Elena and Lydia, and by a promise that, at last, was fulfilled. The days following the release of the consortium's secrets were a whirlwind of tension, relief, and uncertainty. Media outlets around the world dissected the scandal, exposing corruption at the highest levels, and indictments continued to mount. Victor and Ava watched it all unfold from the relative safety of his mansion, shielded from the onslaught of reporters by a team of security guards hired by Greg. Yet, despite the world's eyes on the consortium, the lingering threat against them felt as present as ever. The message Victor had received, "You have made a grave mistake, Mr. Ashton. This isn't over," haunted him. Every noise in the mansion, every unknown phone call, each shadow outside seemed like a potential danger. One afternoon, Greg arrived with news that made the tension even worse. "We've confirmed through my contacts that the consortium hasn't dissolved," he said, his voice grim. "The people we exposed were just the front line. Those at the very top are still intact, and they're regrouping. Their strategy now is simple: neutralize you both and erase any lingering trace of Project Eros." Victor's stomach dropped. "So even after all this, we're still targets." Greg nodded. "They're losing control, but they're not defeated. I've done everything I can to cover your tracks and provide added security, but the truth is, as long as you hold the key to that information, you'll be hunted." Ava looked down, her hand instinctively going to her pendant. "So what do we do now? How can we stop them?" Greg sighed. "There may be a way. Through my network, I managed to locate someone who could help us, a former consortium member who defected years ago. She knows the inner workings of the organization and might be able to provide leverage, a way to get the consortium off your backs for good." Victor's interest was piqued. "Who is she?" Greg hesitated. "Her name is Claudia Reyes. She's been off the grid for over a decade, but from what I understand, she knows the consortium's darkest secrets. She might hold the key to dismantling their leadership." "Where is she?" Ava asked, her voice steady. Greg glanced between them. "She's agreed to meet in a neutral location, but on one condition: you both go alone. Claudia doesn't trust anyone affiliated with the consortium, not even a former investigator like me." Victor exchanged a glance with Ava. He knew the risks of facing someone like Claudia without backup, but if she truly had the information they needed, it might be their only chance to end this nightmare. "I'll do it," Victor said, his voice firm. "If there's even a chance she can help us, we have to try." Ava nodded resolutely. "I'll go too. This isn't just your fight, Victor. I need answers too, for my mother, for Elena, and for myself." Greg looked at them both with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Then I'll make the arrangements. Be careful. Claudia is dangerous, but if you play this right, she might be exactly what we need." The following evening, Victor and Ava arrived at the agreed-upon location, a secluded, abandoned winery on the outskirts of the city. The drive had been tense, each of them casting glances at the darkened countryside, half expecting to be intercepted. The air was thick with anticipation and unease as they parked and approached the derelict building. Inside, the winery's large tasting room was filled with dusty furniture and cracked walls, a relic of a time long past. The faint scent of old wine lingered in the air. A lone figure stood in the shadows, her outline barely visible in the dim light. As they approached, she stepped forward, her face coming into view. Claudia was an imposing woman in her 50s, with sharp features, silver-streaked hair pulled back, and piercing dark eyes that seemed to size them up in an instant. She wore a fitted black jacket and gloves, her demeanor calm but intense. "Mr. Ashton, Miss Stone," Claudia greeted them, her voice smooth and controlled. "You've certainly stirred up quite a storm." Victor nodded, maintaining eye contact. "We came because we need your help. You know the consortium better than anyone. If there's a way to stop them, we need you to tell us." Claudia's gaze flicked between them, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I expected desperation, but I didn't expect determination. That's a dangerous mix." Ava stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're willing to take the risk. You defected from the consortium. If you can help us, you'd be doing the world a favor." Claudia chuckled, her laugh devoid of warmth. "The world, Miss Stone, is rarely worth saving. But the consortium, yes, they're a cancer. And I know how to cut it out." She gestured for them to sit, pulling out a small device from her pocket. After a few moments, the device emitted a faint beep, and Claudia visibly relaxed. "Signal jammer," she explained. "We won't be overheard." Victor leaned forward. "Tell us what you know." Claudia's eyes darkened, and she took a steadying breath. "The consortium has many faces. The members you exposed were influential, yes, but they're replaceable. The true leaders, the ones who call themselves the Council, are untouchable. They operate through layers of intermediaries, never revealing their identities. But they made one critical error years ago. An error I managed to exploit?" "What kind of error?" Victor asked, his pulse quickening. "They centralized too much power. The Council uses a secure, hidden system to manage all their operations, a vault of sorts, called the Black Archive. It contains every piece of blackmail, every transaction, every crime they've committed. It's their lifeline and their greatest weakness." Ava's eyes widened. "So if we access this Black Archive?" Claudia nodded, a spark of intensity in her gaze. "You could destroy them from within, expose their secrets, compromise their power structures. They'd be dismantled." Victor exchanged a look with Ava. "How do we get access?" Claudia's face turned grim. "The Black Archive is protected by biometrics and an encryption system, so advanced it's nearly impenetrable. But there's one access point, a physical one. If you're willing to take the risk, I can lead you there. But understand, once we begin, there's no turning back." Victor glanced at Ava, silently asking her if she was ready. She nodded, her face resolute. "We'll do it," Victor said. "Just tell us where." Claudia gave a curt nod. "Tomorrow night. I'll send the location. You'll need to be prepared for a fight. The consortium doesn't leave its secrets unguarded." The next night found Victor, Ava, and Claudia driving through a dense forest, heading toward an unmarked facility buried deep within the woods. As they approached, Victor's pulse quickened, the gravity of their mission pressing down on him. They parked a short distance from the facility and continued on foot, moving quietly through the shadows. Claudia led the way, her steps confident and precise. "Remember," she whispered as they neared a heavily secured entrance, "we'll need to move fast. The Black Archive's inner chamber has a failsafe that erases everything if it detects a breach. We'll have less than 10 minutes once we're inside." Victor nodded, gripping Ava's hand briefly before letting go. "Stay close. We're in this together." Inside, the facility was dark and cold, its corridors illuminated by dim, flickering lights. Claudia moved with purpose, guiding them through the labyrinthine hallways until they reached a reinforced door. She produced a card from her pocket, swiping it through a panel that emitted a soft beep. The door slid open, revealing a sleek room lined with servers and screens. At the center stood a console with a scanner. "Place your hand here," Claudia instructed Victor. "I've temporarily disabled the security, but we'll only have minutes before it reactivates." Victor took a deep breath, placing his hand on the scanner. The console lit up, and a soft hum filled the room as the Black Archive's database unlocked, granting them access to a trove of information. Working quickly, Claudia and Ava copied files onto encrypted drives, while Victor scanned through records, horrified by the extent of the consortium's reach. Names, transactions, locations. It was all there, proof of the Council's manipulations across the globe. But then a soft alarm began to blare, and Claudia's eyes widened. "We're out of time." They grabbed the drives and turned to leave, but as they reached the door, a group of armed guards appeared, blocking their exit. Victor's heart pounded as he shielded Ava, his mind racing for a way out. Claudia stepped forward, her expression steely. "I'll distract them. You two get out." "No," Ava whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Claudia gave her a sad smile. "I've been running from them long enough. It's time I ended this." She pushed a hidden button on her wristband, triggering a small explosive device that she tossed toward the guards. "Go!" she hissed, shoving them through a side door just as the blast detonated, shaking the walls. Victor and Ava ran, the sounds of the explosion and shouts fading behind them as they made their way back to the car. As they sped away, Victor's heart ached for Claudia. Victor gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he and Ava sped away from the facility, their hearts pounding with the aftermath of Claudia's sacrifice. The weight of her final act pressed heavily on both of them. She had given them a chance, a slim one, to finish what she, Lydia, and Elena had begun years ago. After an hour of silent, tense driving, they finally reached the outskirts of the city and pulled over in a secluded area to catch their breath. The night was dark and quiet, the only sound their ragged breathing. Victor turned to Ava, searching her face. "We have what we need to destroy the consortium," he said softly, holding up the encrypted drives that contained the Black Archive files. "But it came at a cost." Ava's face was pale but resolute, her eyes holding a depth of determination Victor hadn't seen before. "Then we can't let her sacrifice go to waste. We need to release this information. The world has to know the truth." Victor nodded, but his mind churned with questions. Exposing the contents of the Black Archive would bring down the consortium, but it would also put them back in grave danger. Claudia's message had been clear. The Council would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and the warning message Victor had received was a reminder that they were still being hunted. "We need to do this carefully," he said, his voice steady. "If we leak the information all at once, the consortium will come after us with everything they have. But if we release it strategically, piece by piece, it'll give us time to disappear, to stay one step ahead." Ava considered his words and nodded, her hand reaching for her pendant as if seeking reassurance. "I understand. But where do we start?" Victor's mind raced. "We'll start with small, targeted leaks. Information about lower-level operations that doesn't immediately threaten the highest members of the consortium. It'll create enough public interest without triggering an immediate retaliation." As dawn began to break, they made their way back to Victor's mansion, where Greg was waiting anxiously. His face flooded with relief when he saw them, but the severity of their expressions quickly wiped away any sense of reassurance. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tense. Victor explained everything, from Claudia's sacrifice to the Black Archive files and the need for a calculated approach. Greg listened intently, nodding in agreement. "I'll get started on setting up secure channels for the leaks," Greg said. "If we do this right, we'll keep them on their toes without giving away our full hand." For the next few days, Victor, Ava, and Greg operated in a state of high alert, sleeping in shifts and working tirelessly to disseminate carefully selected information to trusted journalists and independent investigators. Each new leak hit the headlines with growing intensity, creating ripples that spread across the globe. The public was starting to see the consortium for what it was, a powerful, insidious network that manipulated economies, influenced governments, and controlled lives in the shadows. But as the pressure mounted, so did the danger. One evening, just as they were finalizing the next leak, Greg received an urgent call from one of his contacts. "They're closing in on you, Victor," Greg said, his face grim. "The Council is escalating their search, and they've mobilized a team. They know you're the source of the leaks, and they'll stop at nothing to silence you." Victor's chest tightened, but he kept his composure. "How much time do we have?" Greg shook his head. "A day, maybe two. We need to move now." Victor looked at Ava, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and determination. She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Wherever we go, I'm with you. I've come too far to back down now." He placed a hand on her shoulder, admiration swelling within him. "Then let's go. There's one place left that might buy us time." They packed essentials, encrypting and securing the drives in a hidden compartment inside Victor's car. As they left the mansion behind, Victor took a route he hadn't traveled in years to a small, secluded property he had purchased as a quiet escape long before he'd ever met Elena. The place was remote, hidden deep within a wooded valley with only one road leading in and out. They arrived just before midnight, and the quietness of the place was both a relief and a reminder of the calm before the storm. They settled in, setting up their laptops and monitoring stations in case they needed to continue their work remotely. But as dawn approached, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was still, too still, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. He paced the perimeter of the cabin, searching for any sign of intruders, but there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet of the wilderness. Inside, Ava sat at a small table, reviewing their files and preparing the next batch of leaks. She looked up when Victor re-entered, sensing his unease. "Do you think they found us?" she asked softly. Victor paused, glancing out the window. "It's possible, but if they're coming, we'll be ready." Greg, who had arrived shortly after them, had set up a series of alarms around the property. The quiet tension grew as the hours passed, and every noise outside seemed to put them all on edge. Then, just after midnight, the alarms went off. The three of them froze, exchanging looks of fear and resolve. Greg grabbed a weapon he'd brought, while Victor quickly directed Ava to the basement, a reinforced area he'd prepared years ago, hoping it would be enough to keep them safe. "We're out of time," Greg whispered. "They're here." They waited in the darkness of the basement, listening as footsteps sounded above, moving methodically through the cabin. The council's team had found them, and there was no telling how many they'd sent. Ava's grip tightened on her pendant, her face pale but determined. Victor moved closer to her, whispering, "No matter what happens, remember that we have the truth. They can't hide from it forever." She nodded, her eyes fierce. "I won't let them win. For my mother, for Elena, for all of us." The footsteps drew nearer, echoing in the silence. Greg motioned for them to stay low, his eyes scanning for any potential exits. Then, with a sudden crash, the basement door was forced open, and a figure in black descended the stairs. Greg moved first, engaging the intruder in a quick, fierce struggle. Victor shielded Ava, pulling her toward a hidden exit he had designed as an emergency escape route. They crawled through the narrow passage, emerging in the dense forest behind the cabin. They ran through the trees, the sounds of shouts and gunfire fading into the background as they put distance between themselves and the cabin. The cold night air filled their lungs as they pressed forward, hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest, where they had hidden a second vehicle. Victor helped Ava inside, and they sped away, leaving behind the chaos that had erupted around the cabin. By dawn, they were miles away, their faces drawn and exhausted, but alive. They found a small, remote motel to rest, though none of them dared sleep deeply. Greg monitored the news, and by midday, they saw the reports. The consortium's reach was beginning to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny and official investigations. The council had lost critical assets, and several of their remaining members were now under investigation. Each new headline brought a sense of victory tempered by the knowledge that their lives would never return to what they once were. As they prepared to leave the motel, Ava turned to Victor, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion in her face. "We did it, didn't we?" Victor nodded, pride and relief washing over him. "Yes, we finished what they started." But even as he said the words, he knew the journey wasn't over. The consortium might be fractured, but remnants of it would remain, dangerous and lurking in the shadows. They would have to remain vigilant, always one step ahead. Victor took Ava's hand, feeling the weight of everything they had endured together. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Ava squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "For my mother, for Elena, for everyone who couldn't finish the fight." Together, they walked away from the motel, prepared to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that they had fought for the truth, and that they would continue to fight, no matter the cost. The following weeks were marked by constant movement. Victor, Ava, and Greg traveled from one city to another, keeping to remote hotels, rural cabins, and occasionally safe houses arranged through Greg's network. They knew the consortium was weakened, but it was still dangerous. Their world had been reduced to a few essential items: laptops loaded with the remaining encrypted files, untraceable phones, and a network of contacts they could trust. But even as they stayed vigilant, the constant upheaval and strain began to wear on them, especially Ava. She'd grown quiet, haunted by memories of her mother and the weight of all they had lost. Victor sensed the burden on her, the mix of grief and duty pulling her between wanting a normal life and her fierce resolve to see justice done. One morning, as they rested at a cabin nestled high in the mountains, Victor found Ava standing by a stream that wound through the forest nearby. Her shoulders were tense, her gaze distant as she looked out over the landscape. He approached quietly, his steps careful on the damp earth. "Ava," she turned, her expression softening slightly when she saw him. "I'm just thinking about everything. It's strange. I never imagined my life would come to this. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if none of this had happened. If my mother hadn't been pulled into the consortium, if she had never met your wife." Victor nodded, understanding the ache in her words. He had often wondered the same. What life would have been like if Elena had never become involved with the consortium, if they had led quiet, uneventful lives together. "I know," he said quietly, "but even as much as I want to imagine that, I believe Elena felt she had to do what she did. She wanted to protect you and keep this evil from hurting more people." Ava took a deep breath, seeming to steady herself. "I just wish I could ask her why. Why she kept it all a secret from me. Why she didn't tell me the truth." Victor's heart ached for her. He knew the pain of unanswered questions, the bitter regret of things left unsaid. "Maybe she thought you'd be safer not knowing. I think it's possible she was trying to protect you from the moment you were born." Ava's fingers tightened around the pendant, her mother's key that had unlocked the path to the truth. "I know, but sometimes it feels like she gave up everything for something that might never truly end." Victor put a hand on her shoulder. "That's why we're going to see this through, Ava. For your mother, for Elena, and for everyone who's been hurt by the consortium." She nodded, a spark of determination reigniting in her eyes. "Then let's finish it." Later that day, they gathered with Greg to discuss the next step. They had whittled down the consortium's power structure through targeted leaks, but the council's elusive leaders, the ones who controlled the remnants of the organization, were still hidden. "We're running out of options," Greg said, spreading out documents on the table. "We've exposed almost everyone they rely on. If we're going to bring down the council, we'll need to find them directly." Victor frowned, considering their dwindling resources. "How many do we think are left?" Greg's eyes darkened. 2, maybe 3. The most powerful ones are still out there, the ones who give the orders but stay hidden in the shadows. Ava leaned forward. "Do we have any leads on who they might be?" Greg hesitated, then pulled out a file he'd been keeping separate from the others. "There is one. The man who's rumored to be at the top. No one knows his true identity, but he's known by the codename Acheron. According to some intel, he operates out of a secure compound in Eastern Europe, surrounded by layers of protection. It's nearly impossible to reach him." A chill ran down Victor's spine. "And if we reach him?" Greg met his gaze. "If we reach him, we might be able to dismantle the consortium once and for all." Victor looked at Ava, her expression mirroring the determination he felt. "Then we have to try." They prepared for the journey with care, knowing this would be their most dangerous mission yet. With Greg's contacts, they managed to secure false identities and passage to an obscure city on the outskirts of Romania. From there, they drove through winding roads into the Carpathian Mountains, stopping in small towns to gather whatever information they could. Finally, they arrived at a secluded village close to Acheron's rumored compound. The villagers, though wary of strangers, hinted at a heavily guarded estate nestled in the mountains, owned by a man no one had ever seen, but whose presence was felt in the constant patrols and secured perimeters. Under cover of darkness, they began their approach, cloaked in shadows as they moved through the dense forest surrounding the compound. Victor's pulse quickened with every step. He knew they were vastly outnumbered, that the compound would be protected by a security force loyal to the consortium. But with Greg's meticulous planning and their shared determination, he believed they had a chance. They approached a point where the trees thinned, giving them a view of the estate. A high, electrified fence encircled it, and guards patrolled in strict patterns. The mansion itself was a fortress, its walls built to repel even the most sophisticated attacks. Greg scoped out the perimeter with binoculars, mapping out their entry points. "There," he whispered, pointing to a service entrance with less frequent guard rotation. "That's our best shot." They waited until the guards turned a corner, then moved swiftly across the clearing and slipped through the entrance, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. Once inside, they navigated a maze of hallways, avoiding patrols and security cameras with Greg's guidance. At last, they reached the inner chambers. Greg paused at the door, his ear pressed against it. After a moment, he nodded, and they stepped inside, finding themselves in a lavish study lined with books and artifacts. At the far end of the room stood a man, his back turned as he stared out the window. "Acheron," Victor called, his voice steady despite the tension. The man turned, his expression calm and unbothered, as if he'd been expecting them. He was older than Victor had imagined, with a mane of silver hair and a cold, calculating gaze. A slight smile touched his lips. "I wondered when you would arrive," he said smoothly, his voice like silk over steel. "I knew your little crusade wouldn't end until you found me." Ava stepped forward, her face resolute. "You've destroyed countless lives. My mother, Elena. They paid the price for your secrets." Acheron's gaze flicked to her, unflinching. "Your mother and Elena were foolish. They thought they could outwit the consortium. They were merely players in a game they never understood." Victor clenched his fists. "Then help us understand. Why go to such lengths? Why manipulate so many lives?" Acheron's smile was cold. "Because control, Mr. Ashton, is the only true power in this world. The consortium exists to wield that power, to bend the world to our will. We don't just influence nations, we own them." Ava's voice trembled with anger. "Your power is crumbling. The world is seeing you for what you are." Acheron's smile faded, and his gaze hardened. "You think you've won? Taking down a few pawns means nothing. The consortium will rebuild. It is unstoppable." Greg moved closer, his hand on his weapon. "Not if we end it here." Acheron laughed softly, as though amused. "End it? Even if you kill me, others will rise. The consortium is an idea, a belief. It lives in shadows, in every dark corner of society. It is eternal." Victor exchanged a look with Ava. He realized then that killing Acheron, even exposing him, would only fuel his legacy. To truly dismantle the consortium, they would need to sever its power from the inside out. Victor spoke, his voice low and firm. "Then tell us how to dismantle it. Every last piece of it." For the first time, Acheron's gaze faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "You can't. I've ensured that no one can touch it." But Victor pressed on. "There must be a way. Tell us, or we'll ensure that your name becomes synonymous with every atrocity, every crime the consortium has committed. You won't be a faceless shadow, you'll be a target." Acheron's composure cracked, and a spark of fear flashed in his eyes. He seemed to weigh his options, realizing that his power, his legacy, was at risk. Finally, with a slow, resigned sigh, he nodded. "There is a failsafe. A series of financial backdoors, coded transactions. If disrupted, it would collapse the consortium's entire infrastructure. But it's buried deep, and only I know the sequence." Victor gestured to Greg, who quickly retrieved a recording device. "Then you'll tell us everything," Victor said, his tone unyielding. "And once you're done, you'll disappear. You'll never touch anyone else's life again." Acheron's gaze narrowed, but he nodded, understanding the terms. He began to speak, detailing the sequence that would unravel the empire he had built in the shadows. By dawn, they had everything they needed. They left the compound quietly, leaving Acheron behind to watch his With Acheron's confession in hand and the sequence needed to dismantle the consortium's infrastructure, Victor, Ava, and Greg moved swiftly. They returned to their safe house in the remote countryside, determined to put an end to the consortium once and for all. They worked tirelessly, sending encrypted copies of the recording to their trusted contacts and preparing the final steps that would disrupt the consortium's financial systems. They knew that as soon as they triggered this failsafe, the consortium's operations would begin to crumble. By the following morning, they were ready. "Is everyone prepared?" Greg asked, his gaze steady as he scanned the room. They all nodded, each understanding the gravity of the moment. This was the culmination of years of pain, sacrifice, and relentless pursuit of justice. Ava looked at Victor, her face resolute yet tinged with sorrow. "Whatever happens, I'm glad we saw this through together. My mother and Elena didn't sacrifice everything for nothing." Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes soft with pride. "They didn't, Ava. They would be proud of you for your courage, your strength, and your loyalty. Today, we're not just ending the consortium. We're honoring their memory." Together, they initiated the sequence Acheron had shared, following each step with precision. The system was complex, designed to trigger a chain reaction of automated withdrawals, asset freezes, and transaction reversals that would effectively bankrupt the consortium. The financial empire that had sustained the organization for decades was unraveling, and each keystroke brought them closer to freedom. As the final command was entered, Victor felt a surge of relief mixed with dread. He knew the fallout would be swift and brutal. Those who remained loyal to the consortium would not sit idly by. Hours later, news of the consortium's financial collapse broke. Headlines flashed across every major news outlet, detailing how a powerful shadow organization had been dismantled in a matter of hours. Assets were seized, offshore accounts were frozen, and those once considered untouchable now faced public disgrace and financial ruin. It was the end of an era, and the world was watching as the curtain lifted on the secrets that had controlled lives in the shadows. For Victor, Ava, and Greg, the victory was hard-won and bittersweet. They knew that while the organization had been crippled, remnants of it might linger, desperate factions clinging to what little power remained. But without the council and without the financial resources that had kept them above the law, the consortium was a ghost of what it once had been. They watched the broadcast from the safety of their remote location, each of them feeling the weight of relief, sorrow, and justice. The next morning, Victor and Ava decided to visit the final resting place of their loved ones, a small cemetery just outside the city where Elena and Lydia had been laid to rest. They walked in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Standing by Elena's grave, Victor felt a rush of emotions, a mixture of love, regret, and gratitude. He placed a hand on the cool stone, his voice quiet. "We did it, Elena. We finished what you started. Your secrets, your sacrifices, they meant something." Ava knelt by Lydia's grave, her fingers tracing her mother's name. "I wish you could see this, Mom. I wish you could know that everything you went through, it wasn't in vain." They stood together in silence for a few minutes, letting the weight of the past settle around them. Ava looked at Victor, her expression one of quiet strength. "What happens now?" Victor thought for a moment, a small smile breaking through the weariness in his eyes. "Now, we start over. We find a life that isn't about running, fighting, or hiding. We live freely, without shadows." Ava nodded, her gaze steady and hopeful. "And we remember them. We remember what they fought for." They left the cemetery with lighter hearts, carrying the memory of their loved ones with them as they stepped into an uncertain but hopeful future. Back at the safe house, Greg had prepared their last round of preparations for a full disappearance. With new identities and plans for a quiet life far from the public eye, they were ready to begin again, free from the ghosts of the consortium. They each shared a final, quiet dinner together, celebrating their freedom with a sense of calm and camaraderie that had been absent for so long. As they packed to leave the next morning, Ava lingered near the door, her pendant glinting in the morning light. She turned to Victor, a question in her eyes. "Do you think we'll ever truly be free of them?" Victor met her gaze, a thoughtful look on his face. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do. The consortium is gone, and with it, the hold they had over our lives. Now, we live on our own terms. Ava smiled, a soft, grateful expression. Thank you, Victor, for everything. They stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on their faces, finally at peace. The consortium was gone, and those scars remained. They were now free to heal, to live, and to remember, honoring the legacy of those they had loved and lost. Together, they drove away, leaving the shadows behind.